This video is quite a bit older than what I normally cover, especially regarding politically charged topics. However, given it's about historical events and the owner has not disowned it, I see it as fair game. The video I'm talking about being Razorfist's video on Abraham Lincoln. I want to point out, by the way, the description has a bibliography, which I assume is just the books Razorfist primarily used to make this video. And I couldn't help but notice that two of the books were written by Thomas J. DiLorenzo, a well-known pseudo-historian. I'm going to recommend both the Rational Wiki article on him for a more in-depth profile on who he is, and a review of his book The Real Lincoln, one of the books Razorfist cites, if you are interested in more specific examples of him making factually incorrect statements. Razorfist also brings up DiLorenzo in the video itself at one point in order to say this.
Particularly as the most vocal critics of Abraham Lincoln in the modern day generally hail from Rothbardian libertarian political circles, where accusing one of supporting something like slavery is just absurd enough to be mistaken for modern Marvel movie dialogue.
And his evidence of this is one book written by one guy who is from libertarian Rothbardian political circles. That doesn't prove anything. Also, it's Rogers Hummel, not Roger Hummel.
You all know the top-hatted caricature of Honest Abe. Hell, in preparation for this video, I consumed no small number of primary sources suffused with praise that lapsed eagerly and often from fawning to disquietingly worshipful. Worshipful, you say? Of a man whose monument depicts him on a literal throne? Surely you jest! Which in and of itself, in a nation that created the office of president for the explicit purpose of forestalling such breathless pronouncements of kingly virtue in our leaders, should be alarming all on its own.
Okay, a couple of issues. First off, what do you mean by virtue? Do you think our founder's issue with King George III was that he was just too good of a guy? That was just a bizarre word to use there. Second off, the presidency wasn't created in opposition to monarchy. It was created in response to Shays' rebellion, and with that, the understanding that the main flaw of the Articles of Confederation was that it lacked a strong executive. This actually makes this meme kind of funny for a reason you didn't intend, by the way, because one of the central weaknesses with the Articles of Confederation was that it didn't really force people to pay taxes. And it's rather difficult to fund a government if you can't tax the population, because then they aren't giving you any money to fund the government with. Speaking of basic history facts that Razorfist gets wrong, he goes on to say this.
And if Andrew Jackson, himself something of an authoritarian, was the first of the non-founding father presidents...
Andrew Jackson wasn't the first non-founding father president. That was John Quincy Adams. James Monroe being the last of the founding father presidents, and John Quincy Adams being the one who took office after he left it. Now, if Andrew Jackson counts as an authoritarian is debatable, to say the least. However, I am not going to sit here and pretend like that's an uncommon view for scholars to hold today, nor an uncommon one for people to have held at the time. The Whig Party was even created specifically in opposition to what they felt was the authoritarianism of Andrew Jackson, naming themselves after a British political party which was opposed to royal pejoratives. I mention this because here's how Razorfist describes the Whig Party later in this video.
But as I alluded in a prior video, America's homegrown political binary is the small government states' rights of Thomas Jefferson and the Democrats versus the statist centralized pseudo-monarchist government of Alexander Hamilton and later the Whigs, themselves not coincidentally named after an English political party.
And they showed this through choosing their name after a political party that specifically existed to challenge the authority of the monarchy in opposition to a president whose critics referred to him as King Andrew. If they were pseudo-monarchists, they really had an odd way of showing it is all I'm saying. Especially given a monarchy is a political system where one person has all of the control over how politics is gone about in that nation. It's a rule of one, essentially. The issue the Whigs had with Andrew Jackson was that he was essentially acting as the sole authority of the government. taking policy-making into his own hands as opposed to allowing it to primarily be the job of Congress as it had been up until that point. This can even be seen in how William Henry Harrison, the first Whig president, refused to give out policy specifics while he was campaigning in 1840, and said in his inaugural address that he disliked the idea that the president should have a role in policy making, essentially promising to allow Congress to do whatever it wanted. The second Whig president, by the way, was John Tyler, who supported secession and was elected to serve in the Confederacy's Congress. Also, and this is purely just advice and rhetoric, Razorfist, but if you're going to call Andrew Jackson somewhat of an authoritarian, maybe don't also try to paint the Whigs as an authoritarian party while discussing how specifically Henry Clay battled with Jackson over the Second National Bank.
When President Andrew Jackson fought and won in an attempt to dissolve the National Bank, it was Henry Clay who served as the primary antagonist.
Okay, so Andrew Jackson was somewhat of an authoritarian, but this person who fought him over something is also the bad guy and himself a massive authoritarian. Why would somebody who's an authoritarian support something that it was authoritarian to oppose? I don't get your train of logic here at all. And I'd imagine if I had no knowledge of the events in question, I'd be incredibly confused right now. Also, while I'm talking about Henry Clay anyway,
Clay believed wholeheartedly in what he called the American system, originally generated by Alexander Hamilton.
So before I explain why this is wrong, I need to give a bit of historical context. Specifically, you have to understand that when the United States was first formed, one of the first big political debates that was had was over if the country would be primarily agricultural or industrial. Here's ThoughtCo explaining Alexander Hamilton's position on this debate better than I ever could.
Second, he wanted the U.S. to be a manufacturing powerhouse. We wouldn't just buy and sell stuff, we would make it too. He even invested in a plan to make Paterson, New Jersey, a manufacturing hub, which of course ultimately failed because New Jersey. But to make a manufacturing giant, he needed a strong government that could build infrastructure and protect patents, but you already knew that he was in favor of a strong government because of course he wrote so many of the Federalist Papers.
Henry Clay's American system essentially argued that was a false dichotomy, and therefore the debate Alexander Hamilton had spent much of his time focusing on was utterly pointless. Instead, Clay believed the U.S. should be focusing on both agriculture and manufacturing. My source for this is an article he himself cites, by the way. Also, what exactly was the point in playing this old film clip? It has no connection to anything that's being talked about outside of the fact that it shows Henry Clay using the phrase the American system, but it has nothing to do with domestic economics. It's a speech about foreign policy, specifically if the US should back democracies in South America that Europe was trying to intervene with. I'll even play you guys it. And I mean the full version, not the clip Razorfist plays because he cut the context so this was all left out.
In Washington, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, fighting champion of American liberty, ringingly challenged the autocratic aims of the European monarchy.
It lies within our power to create a system by which all our sister nations of South America shall act with us. Our present institutions make us free. But how long shall we be free if we allow Europe to gain another foothold in the Western Hemisphere? Let us break all old world fetters. Why should we bow to the whims of European politicians? Let us become real and true Americans, and with our sister nations of the South, build an American system that nothing shall ever destroy.
Also, since I'm still talking about Henry Clay anyway, here's another thing that's just wrong.
When they call Lincoln a liberator and freedom fighter, understand that these are the very lies Lincoln told at Henry Clay's funeral, at which he delivered a famous, highly politicized eulogy.
Lincoln's eulogy to Henry Clay wasn't even on the same day as his funeral. What are you talking about? Anyway, this video is divided into chapters, and although I will be skipping around like usual, as I just proved by skipping around, I will be attempting to keep each segment primarily related to its corresponding chapter. So, let's begin this. The first thing Razorfist does in this chapter is attempt to use Lincoln's own words to prove that the Civil War was economic in nature.
The idea that the Civil War was not principally waged over slavery, but was, like most any other war, primarily economic in nature, doesn't come from lost causers. It doesn't come from me. It comes from fucking Lincoln. Upon ascending to office in 1861 under the cloud of war, secession, and foreign interference, Lincoln stated outright what the most important objective of his administration was. Not bringing the South to heel, and certainly not freeing the blacks he'd repeatedly referred to as inferior up until that point. No. Are you ready for the great emancipator's primary preoccupation? Raising fucking tariffs.
A couple of things. First off, this quote was not upon Lincoln taking office. That happened in 1861. Meanwhile, the picture you use dates the quote to 1860, the year prior. Lincoln also did not say this was his chief political purpose, just merely something he supported. And in fact, if you read the full statement, it's made clear he essentially says he's not really going to take a position on tariffs as president, outside of personal support for them. In the days of Henry Clay, I was a Henry Clay tariff man, and my views have undergone no material change upon that subject. I now think the tariff question ought not to be agitated in the Chicago Convention, but that all should be satisfied on that point, with a presidential candidate whose antecedents give assurance that he would neither seek to force a tariff law by executive influence, nor yet to arrest a reasonable one by a veto or otherwise. Just such a candidate I desire shall be put in nomination. I really have no objection to these views being publicly known, but I do wish to thrust no letter before the public now upon any subject. Save me from the appearance of obtrusion, and I do not care who sees this or my former letter. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln.
At the risk of becoming convoluted, before I can dismantle the myth of a civil war over slavery, we need to tackle another omnipresent falsehood. The myth of the partisan flip. Stop me if you've heard this one before. It's some indeterminate, eternally ephemeral date. Sometimes the Civil War, sometimes the Civil Rights era. Hell, I've even heard Nixon. Republicans and Democrats pulled the old partisan switcheroo. Republicans had been central government status and suddenly switched to the party of personal responsibility and small government, while the minarchist Southern Democrats became the Progressive Party. The details of why this happened are left hazier than Ted Kennedy's memory on the night of July 18th, 1969.
I just want to point out that Razorfist says this after showing this article, which is filled with details and dates to explain why this occurred. It notes how during the Civil War, many Northern industrialists got wealthy and joined the Republican Party, many of whom had little interest in protecting the rights of Black Americans. It notes how many of these wealthy industrialists were opposed to government regulation and intervention in the economy, and therefore this put them at odds with the 1932 Democratic nomination, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it notes that, although support for civil rights was originally regional and not partisan, it became much more partisan after the 1964 presidential election saw Lyndon Johnson, who supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and even signed it into law, running against Republican Barry Goldwater, who was against the piece of legislation. I'm not even saying any of this is true. I am saying that Razorfist's description of how this is described, with this article being his example, is incredibly dishonest.
When considering the cause of a crime, in this case the Civil War, before you can begin to look for evidence, you need to look for patterns. Places the victim frequented, people that had motive or opportunity that they had a pattern of contact with. The problem with the narrative that the Civil War was caused by slavery is that a civil war is a symptom, not a cause, an end result of a crisis of secession. When a state or several begin exploring or enacting articles of secession to separate themselves from the federal government, most defenders of the North and Lincoln then fall back to the position that the secession crisis was caused by slavery. But the problem with that is that it doesn't fit the pattern. There was a prior secession crisis that fell just short of the Civil War in 1828.
As seen by this article, which clearly labels itself as discussing an event from 1813. Razorfist makes the same mistake later in the video, by the way, saying the New England secessionists existed 20 years before the Civil War.
I have no sympathies with the Confederacy, save the perfectly valid grievances they had for desiring secession, such as disproportionate taxation, underrepresentation, and astronomically high tariffs, but I share those very same sympathies with the New England secessionists of 20 years previously.
Even though, assuming he's talking about the same event, it was actually closer to 45 or 50 years by the time of the Civil War, not 20.
When Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln's self-professed political idol, passed the Tariff of Abominations, a sky-high tariff rate shoved through by Lincoln's previous party, the Whigs, placing a disproportionate financial burden upon the South, who accounted for over 70% of all exported goods and boasted the fourth largest economy in the world at the time, as we've already established.
Okay, a couple of things. First off, it would be rather difficult for the Whig Party to force this tariff through Congress, given the Whig Party didn't exist yet. The legislation being referred to here was the Tariff of 1828, which was passed in 1828. The Whig Party wouldn't even be founded until 1834, 6 years later. Also, Henry Clay didn't have the power to pass anything. He was a singular congressman. He also wasn't even the one who wrote the tariff bill. It was first proposed by Celeste Wright, who was an ally of Andrew Jackson. You know, the guy the Whig Party would later form specifically to oppose.
South Carolina held a special session of state Congress and voted to nullify the tariff, leading the nation to the precipice of outright secession. No mention of slavery, no moral grandstanding about abolition, particularly as Henry Clay himself had owned slaves. High tariffs followed by a secession crisis. Sort of like the exact same thing that preceded the secession crisis that sparked the American Civil War.
On screen is a graph of tariff rates throughout U.S. history that was compiled by Pew Research. You guys notice something? There wasn't a spike in tariffs before the Civil War. In fact, tariffs had been consistently going down since around the passage of the Tariff of Abomination. So there wasn't a raise in tariffs, meaning, to use your term, it doesn't fit the pattern. And this alleged pattern gets even more confusing when you include the aforementioned New England secessionists, because that was over the War of 1812. You yourself acknowledge that several states in New England refused to help the federal government fight said conflict.
James Madison never invoked war powers when New England refused to participate in the War of 1812, effectively seceding from their official obligations in that conflict.
However, although opposition in New England was largely based on the fact that the war disrupted trade with Britain, it had nothing to do with the tariff rate. And although that may sound like an oddly specific point to make, I mention it because Razorfist presents a massive false dichotomy. Either the war was about slavery or it was about economics. You heard him say earlier that it was primarily economic in nature after all. However, the economics of the South were closely tied with slavery. That's a large chunk of the reason as to why the South developed the way it did.
But certainly the most prominent effects of the slave-based economy were seen in the South. The profitability of slave-based agriculture, especially king cotton, meant that the South would remain largely agricultural and rural. Slave states were home to a few cities, like St. Louis and Baltimore, but with the exception of New Orleans, almost all Southern urbanization took place in the upper South, further away from the large cotton plantations. And slave-based agriculture was so profitable that it siphoned money away from other economic endeavors. Like, there was very little industry in the South. It produced only 10% of the nation's manufactured goods, and as most of the capital was being plowed into the purchase of slaves, there was very little room for technological innovation, like, for instance, railroad.
Yeah, this whole ranting about previous secession falls apart on the basis that this was an entirely different situation. The only thing these two events have in common is secession was discussed. However, when you attempt to dig any deeper than that, you notice a massive amount of differences. Differences that you have to ignore if you want to make the point that Razorfist is currently making. Anyway, Razorfist goes on to talk about Henry Clay and the Whig Party for a bit. Given I already discussed that, I'm just cutting that entire part out. However, I do want to point out his thesis for bringing all of this up was,
Reformed Whigs turned Democrats soon arose to the highest stations of Southern power. Their focus on state subsidy of industry and the economy led them to be commercially interlocked with plantation owners. And it's likely for this reason that every one of the small handful of states which cited slavery as one but not all of the reasons for seceding just so happened to be in the hands of former Whigs turned Democrats. The Whig wing of the Democratic Party partly incited a civil war that they would later pin on the Jeffersonian Democrats during the post-war period.
For those who would like to see his evidence to back up this claim, honestly, so would I. He just doesn't show us it.
By entangling the valid arguments for secession proffered by Jeffersonian Democrats with the falsehoods perpetuated by former Whigs, not to mention the post-war Northern academics largely responsible for promulgating the lost cause myth, defenders of the dictator Lincoln have intertangled, vitiated, and discredited by default the very arguments that disproved their faulty hypothesis with a snarling scapegoat that was not, in fact, invented in the South. It was invented and espoused overwhelmingly by Northern academics.
I'm sorry, it wasn't invented in the South? That's just factually incorrect. The term lost cause comes from Southern journalist Edward Pollard, author of the book The Lost Cause, A New Southern History of the War of the Confederates. Pollard being a pro-slavery writer who was also the principal editor of the Richmond Examiner, a newspaper that supported the Confederacy.
Case in point, probably the most prominent exemplar of a lost causer in the 20th century was waspy Whig Democrat and all-around shitbag du jour, Woodrow Wilson, who famously screened The Birth of a Nation at the White House. What was Woody Wilson prior to being president? A Jeffersonian sharecropper? Deep South croc wrangler, perhaps. Oh, that's right. He was a Northern academic. Hey, remind me again who, until only recently, the Public Policy Department at Princeton University was named after.
A couple things. First off, what the fuck is a Jeffersonian sharecropper? I know what a sharecropper is, but I didn't realize you could do it in a Jeffersonian manner. Out of curiosity, were there also Hamiltonian sharecroppers? Second off, Woodrow Wilson was not a Northerner. Wilson was raised in the Deep South in his early years during the Civil War, and that background played a massive role in shaping his politics later in life. Also, even if Woodrow Wilson's the most famous name, he is not the primary example of a lost causer at that point in history. Vox has a video going into this, but the primary cause for the lost cause narrative getting so big was the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who were an organization primarily made up of descendants of antebellum slave owners. This section is about the Emancipation Proclamation primarily. Here's Razorfist's introduction.
Here's where we get spicy. The accepted mainstream narrative surrounding the Emancipation Proclamation is, without question, the wildest propagandist fiction ever penned by political historians, one-upping with ease all the most brazen Bolshevik reframes of the Cold War combined. To hear history teachers tell it, Lincoln, the lifelong atheist, laid hand to the Bible, unilaterally declared black men free, and so the shackles of untold thousands suddenly shattered in unison. The problem with this assertion is that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free a single slave. Process that for a beat. Not one!
This is just factually untrue. Although the Emancipation Proclamation was limited, there were still parts of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Virginia where there was slavery and which were occupied by federal troops, where the Emancipation Proclamation applied, and therefore the slaves in those locations were freed immediately.
And the reason why is simple and admitted by both Lincoln and his entire cabinet. It only applied to the South, rebel territory, which Lincoln did not at that point control. In fact, at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation's issuance, the Union didn't control a whole hell of a lot. The war was going poorly. Despite outnumbering their Confederate adversaries in most major engagements, the Civil War to that point could best be categorized as several months of occasional victories bracketed by a ceaseless deluge of double-dong defeat. And given Lincoln's legendary penchant for micromanaging the military, the failure was disproportionately his. And the foreign press were beginning to speculate that if he suffered another Fredericksburg-scale defeat, the Confederates may well have the opportunity to demand concessions or outright surrender.
You know, the Emancipation Proclamation was unveiled before the Battle of Fredericksburg, right? The Emancipation Proclamation was introduced on September 22nd, 1862. The Battle of Fredericksburg occurred that December. And by the way, later on, he even says this shows the state of the war when the document was drafted.
Perhaps no battle better typifies the state of miserable desperation President Lincoln found himself in when the document was drafted than the aforementioned Battle of Fredericksburg,
which would have been an even earlier point in the war, so this makes even less sense. I also want to take a moment real quick and discuss this part. You see, Razorfist talks about the reaction to the Emancipation Proclamation at the time, and he notes the following.
Major newspapers both in America and abroad chided it as toothless posturing, and Lincoln's own Secretary of State, William Seward, mocked his own boss and his proclamation in a private letter saying, quote, "We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them and holding them in bondage where we could set them free," unquote.
I mentioned this because although there are some fairly neutral mentions of William Seward later in the video before the part I'm about to show you, this is the only thing that could even be spun as a positive mention of him. About 20 minutes later, we hear Razorfist say,
Seward was also the fucking Himmler of the Lincoln cabinet. After Lincoln's unilateral assertion that he possessed emergency powers enumerated precisely fucking nowhere in the Constitution, and with pro-secession sentiment reaching a fever pitch in the North, given the tight business ties between New York entrepreneurs and their trading partners in the South, Seward set out forming a secret police whose stated goal was to suss out, and I quote, disloyalty. But functionally speaking, they were professional quashers of dissent. Period. Praise Jefferson Davis. Better hope your Republican neighbor didn't overhear. With habeas corpus suspended, you can and will be arrested without trial. And many, many were.
Which should lead you to ask the question, who gives a fuck what that guy thinks then? I mean, I don't exactly care what Himmler thinks. Apparently this guy is comparable to Himmler, so naturally I shouldn't care what he thinks. Why did you quote him? Anyway, I've been ignoring most of the unsubstantiated claims because there's really not a reason to cover every single one of them, and if I did, we'd be here all day and most of the commentary would just be me going citation needed. However, I do feel like I should highlight this one.
But if it wasn't about freeing slaves in the South, because it didn't, and Lincoln explicitly forbade freeing slaves in areas held by the Union, what the hell was it supposed to accomplish? Oh, nothing much. Just government-mandated rape and murder. See, with the bulk of fighting men away, fighting for the Confederacy in the South, the plantation's daily management, for the most part, fell to female members of the family. Wives, in particular. See where I'm going with this? Lincoln wasn't declaring Southern slaves free. He was telling them to rise up and murder the primarily female managerial class of said plantations in the hopes that engineering a full-blown revolt would weaken economic production enough to give a much-needed edge to the Union in a time when they were losing. It wasn't so much a Hail Mary as a call to murder and fucking deflower her.
I don't even know what I need to say in response to that other than, what in the fuck are you going on about? I'm not even saying for sure you can't make an argument to substantiate that case. Maybe you could. I am saying you haven't actually bothered to do so. You haven't shown us any evidence of this being the reason why it was enacted, nor have you even really attempted to. You've just asserted it without any sort of justification outside of a series of other events from the war.
Look, if the Civil War was truly fought over slavery, no one would be more surprised than veterans of the Union. Not because I say so, but because when the Emancipation Proclamation dropped, They did! Over 200,000 Northern troops deserted in protest over the next few months, with nearly as many draft dodgers.
And that was really difficult for them to do, given the draft wasn't implemented until March 1863.
Far from achieving the intended effect, not only did Southern slaves not engage in mass revolt, the immediate aftermath saw a race riot erupt in New York City to protest the proclamation's issuance, along with Lincoln's other unpopular law, conscription.
And by immediate aftermath, he means an event that occurred in July 1863, 10 months after the proclamation was originally issued. I also want to take a moment to discuss how Razorfist uses this as a jumping off point in order to discuss the North more generally, calling it a bunch of mini Lincolns.
The draft riots were, in essence, a series of anti-black and anti-Republican crimes perpetrated by an army of mini Lincolns. The North was Lincoln, having not received a single electoral vote outside of it.
Even though he also mentions later that despite the North being Lincoln, New York City's mayor was a vocal critic of Lincoln.
Fernando Wood, then mayor of New York City, himself an incisive critic of Old Abe.
No, I'm not entirely sure how that works, and I'm not even going to make any attempt to figure it out.
Now, you contrast this with how Southern soldiers saw their role in why they were fighting.
By soldiers, Razorfist meant soldier, as he is only discussing one soldier, or to be more specific, playing a couple minutes of audio from an interview he had with somebody else in the 1940s. This person was 16 at the time and by his own admission did not understand the greater political context of what was occurring. And by the way, even if this one soldier did in fact fight for the right of his home state and not for slavery, that still doesn't change why the South seceded, nor does it inherently make him representative of the entirety of the Confederate Army or any other person that wasn't him specifically. Anyway, Razorfist talks about the New York draft riots and how the North was incredibly racist, and he's not incorrect to point that out. With that said, there are still some rather unsubstantiated claims, like this one.
As the Civil War raged, European powers who had long ago ended slavery peacefully began to worry about trading with a slave state, so they dispatched envoys to assess the violent nature of slavery stateside. Every single one determined slavery was a more brutal practice by far in the North than it was in the South, with none other than New Jersey singled out as the worst place in the world to live as a slave.
That is said nowhere in this article, and I have no idea where he got that impression. I'm not even saying it's wrong, I'm just saying I haven't seen a source for it. Anyway, he talks about John Fremont for a bit, and then here's another bizarre claim of his.
It was in response to criticism over this very act from his own side that Lincoln was compelled to write a letter addressing it to the New York Tribune's Horace Greeley, from which emerged the fabled quote you'll often see fallaciously cited by leering Lincolnites waxing pragmatic about how it was all just really to preserve the Union. And I quote, "If I could preserve the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it," unquote. That the Union was already dissolved by Lincoln when he made it effectively involuntary under penalty of arrest, deportation, or death failed to make the fucking article. Ironically, this oft-cited quote is an explicit contradiction of Lincoln's myriad prior statements, which asserted that the president has no constitutional authority to act on the issue of slavery, meaning that essentially with this single newspaper quote, Lincoln just publicly declared himself dictator.
Why do you think Lincoln said "if" in that quote? More than likely, it's because this was something that he would have gladly done if it meant keeping the Union together, but understood that, according to you at least, to not be a legal possibility. Also, this quote from Lincoln is not him saying the president lacks constitutional authority to act on the issue of slavery. That's just not a thing this quote says or even implies. If anything, it's more aimed at the political turmoil abolition would cause in Lincoln's eyes if it were implemented, while also criticizing the zealotry of abolitionists through pointing out how extreme their position is. However, extreme positions are constitutional sometimes. You do understand that, right?
When it comes right down to nut cutting, truth of the matter is Abraham Lincoln was America's very first dictator. Many such mongoloids in academia make the more elevated argument that he was like a benevolent king.
As seen by this article, which specifically calls Lincoln a dictator and, best as I can tell, never uses the words benevolent or king. This guy is really bad at citing sources, I've noticed.
Which frankly is a spin so charitable it ought to be fucking tax exempt. Under the Magna Carta, the king or queen of England could suspend habeas corpus, meaning the requirement to be told what you're being charged with and provided with legal counsel only through an act of parliament.
A representative parliament didn't even exist until 80 years after Magna Carta was signed. That might have been the law of England at the time, I'm not denying that. However, his phrasing was, at the very least, historically inaccurate.
He circumvented Congress entirely and suspended habeas corpus his own damn self, then set upon the enterprise of deporting his political enemies in the North or jailing them for infractions as minor as neglecting to include a prayer for Abraham Lincoln at the beginning of a public church service. As no shit, the Lincoln administration required by what they construed as law for the duration of his despotic administration.
So that's not a thing that happened at all? That was an order from a handful of generals, one of whom was directly rebutted by the Lincoln administration when it came to their attention. The idea this was something President Lincoln himself demanded is utterly nonsensical and not backed up by the historical evidence.
Secretary of State William Seward would later be heard bragging to British diplomats that he had more authority to jail his enemies than the Queen herself.
Well, yeah, by that point, most political power had been in the hands of Parliament for a couple of centuries. Something which you not only understood when talking about the suspension of habeas corpus, but also which you show an understanding of later in the video when you talk about the United Kingdom's political structure during the time of the American Revolution.
Every crime the founders ascribed to the English and King George, though more rightly credited to Parliament, who at that point were far from funkadelic.
William Seward probably did have more power to jail his political opponents than the Queen of England, as did anybody who had any more power to jail their political opponents than politely asking somebody else to do it for them.
So aggrieved were the residents of Maryland that the state legislature began holding debates on the merits of seceding themselves. Lincoln flipped his fucking shit. The legislature acceded to his wishes and publicly declared they would not be voting on secession. Only for totally not a dictator Abraham Lincoln to arrest the entire state legislature of the state of Maryland all the same, those who didn't fucking flee anyway.
This is another thing the president had nothing to do with. It was the work of William Seward, the aforementioned Secretary of State, and the guy who Razorfist quotes and compares to Himmler. He was the one behind this, not the president. And we have no reason to believe Lincoln was involved in any way with this event. He also goes on to discuss the arrest of Francis Key Howard.
The local press pitched a fucking fit, with one editorialist penning a scathing indictment in the pages of the Baltimore Exchange, deploring the president for his autocratic proclivities. He was immediately imprisoned, and he was in good company. Over the coming year, an estimated 13,000 political opponents and journalist critics in the North would be arrested without charge or affordance of trial. That editorialist's name? Francis Key Howard.
But Howard makes it very clear in the opening to his memoir on the situation that it was under the orders of Seward, not Lincoln, that this occurred. This, by the way, comes from a book Razorfist name drops.
Incidentally, Howard's incarceration would provide the subject for the book 14 Months in American Bastilles.
I also want to point out that Razorfist decides to make it a point to talk about how Francis Key Howard was the grandson of Francis Scott Key.
Grandson of American icon Francis Scott Key, the lawyer and poet who famously authored The Star-Spangled Banner while witnessing the English assault on none other than Fort McHenry. The very same fort that his grandson and thousands of others were now held in without charge or legal counsel for months on end, all for the crime of criticizing the president in print. Honest Abe, ladies and gentlemen.
Which, don't get me wrong, is an interesting irony in history. However, the way he expresses it makes me believe he's genuinely trying to use it as a point on its own. Not helped by the fact this isn't even the only time he does this. Later on, he makes it a point to mention how Thomas Jefferson's grandson fought for the Confederacy.
Oh, and Thomas Jefferson, the author of said document, his grandson, Thomas Garland Jefferson, fought for the Confederacy and died at the Battle of Newmarket.
And another grandson of Thomas Jefferson, that being John Wales Jefferson, fought for the Union. And again, I can't help but wonder what exactly the point of mentioning this was. Does it make the cause of the Confederacy any more valid? Does it make the cause of the Union any more valid that another one of Thomas Jefferson's grandchildren fought for it? No, of course not. Similarly, what was the point in mentioning earlier that Abraham Lincoln's father was a slave catcher?
Hell, Abraham Lincoln's father, Thomas, worked as a fucking slave catcher.
Never mind, we also have primary evidence that Thomas Lincoln was opposed to slavery as well. So let's throw that in there and create an even bigger mess. But also, this is just another superfluous detail. What does Lincoln's father's career have to do with him? What does a Confederate soldier being Thomas Jefferson's grandson have to do with the legitimacy of the Confederacy? And I find it weird you're focusing so much on the heredity of these political figures, given, well, it's a lot more monarchical than having somebody sit on a throne.
Folks, Lincoln wasn't a king. Whatever the literally sitting on a fucking throne Lincoln monument might suggest.
Which was due to the design being inspired by the Greek, I should note, because that is the birthplace of democracy. It's not supposed to make Lincoln look like a king, it's supposed to make him look cool.
If you are a defender of Abraham Lincoln's assumption of dictatorial powers to preserve the Union, there is one inexplicable and indefensible fact that simply will not die. If Abraham Lincoln's cause was ending slavery rather than preserving a territorial and taxation monopoly, then why, with all the powers at his disposal, did he never use one of them to force manumission or compensated emancipation of slaves? The two policies that worked in Europe 2 decades before the American Civil War was even a distant danger. If he had the dictatorial power to raise an army with a draft, jail journalists, shutter newspapers, arrest judges, and deport his political adversaries, he had the power to force through the same policy that freed slaves in under 6 years in England, and did so without firing a fucking shot. And there's only one answer. He didn't want to free slaves, and saving the Union was the code word he used interchangeably to obfuscate his true agenda.
Because that would have been even more politically unfeasible. Remember, slavery was an important institution to the South at this time, as well as a large basis for their economy, especially given how it helped prop up their agricultural sector, which was the vast majority of their economy. The fact is, in order to compensate them in a manner that wouldn't cause massive backlash, you'd be having to give them large amounts of money, way more than you realistically could justify politically. Especially given, it could easily piss off the other half of the country. And that's not even getting into the fact that you would be paying them a flat fee for something they widely saw as an investment. Yes, it worked in certain countries in Europe, although even there were a lot of problems, mostly regarding the economics of engaging in this. However, this is a very different situation.
The black heart of the Civil War holds an even more darksome truth by far. As I've previously intimated, not only was it not waged to end the enterprise of slavery, it was arguably only peripherally waged even to preserve the territorial and tax monopoly they held during a time of financial crisis in the North. Look, in a central philosophical context, the real reason the Civil War was waged was to end the heretofore universally acknowledged right of secession.
It was not universally acknowledged, not even close. You mentioned James Madison earlier in this video, even mocking Lincoln for thinking he knows better than James Madison on the Constitution.
Lincoln, meanwhile, knew better than the father of the Constitution.
But Madison believed secession was only constitutional if the federal government agreed to do it. Essentially, states could not unilaterally declare themselves their own nations. However, states could enter mutual agreements with the federal government to leave the Union. That's not what the South did.
Old Abe himself later appeared to reverse position on the subject of secession when he helped set up a Republican puppet state in the western half of Virginia in 1864 and incite them to what? Secede! Unfortunately for him, it was also unconstitutional, as the federal government has no constitutional authority to simply make a seceding state. Governments are explicitly defined as being created by the people within said region.
And West Virginia met that criteria, given it was the result of an organic movement that called for a separation from the greater state of Virginia that dated back to the early 19th century. The final straw being Virginia's decision to join the Confederacy, which the West opposed. The West also disagreed with the rest of Virginia having such a great emphasis on slavery more generally, because this conflict had quite a bit to do with slavery, it turns out.
In fact, if one goes categorically through the Declaration of Independence to the so-called train of abuses Jefferson and the Funky Bunch claimed they'd suffered under English occupation, well, let's just say the slightest of patterns emerges. Point number one, King George abolished their representation and installed English minders, effectively regional dictators, to oversee incompliant colonies. Sorta kinda like the martial law conquered southern territories labored under, or the outright military dictatorships that ruled over the southern United States for another, 12 titty fucking years after the Civil War.
Okay, first off, I thought this video was about Abraham Lincoln. Why did you mention Reconstruction? And second off, there is a massive difference between arbitrarily determining that a self-sufficient colony needs to be ruled by your laws, as was what happened under King George, and occupying an enemy after a war.
Point number three, the King of England created new bureaucratic offices from whole cloth while sending, quote, swarms of officers to harass the people and eat their sustenance, like, Abraham Lincoln's bureaucratic hydra that oversaw Southern affairs even long after his death.
Again, the context is so radically different that these things cannot be compared. Just answer me this, Razorfist. If you can answer me this, I will concede your entire point as correct. When did the United States lose a war against England? Because without that, again, this goes from somebody arbitrarily opposing their will onto you to a completely normal and totally understandable response to defeating an armed foe. Also, in spite all of this, self-government in the South was never gotten rid of. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like it wasn't curtailed to some extent. Again, they just lost an armed conflict that is completely routine. But elections were still held. The South still had the ability to vote in federal elections. It's not as if people from the administration were just appointed into bureaucratic offices that held all the power. There were still state legislators, there were still elected governors, and so on and so forth. And by the way, these elections meant the South could go to Congress, the legislative body, and argue their case, as well as work to create legislation which advanced their interest and stop legislation which harmed it, something the colonists had no ability to do whatsoever. I'm sorry, but there's just no comparison here. Even if you think Reconstruction crossed the line in terms of how much self-governance was curtailed, which is an opinion you are allowed to have, I want to be very clear about that. You can make that case if you so choose. It's not the same as living under King George III in the Americas during the time of the Revolution.
And as for swarms of soldiers, would you consider, say, a secret police that at one point was ordered to fire upon and murder hundreds of New York protesters during the draft riots to be all swarm-like?
That was to put down a rebellion against a law passed by Congress and signed by the elected president. It's really not even that much more brutal than what was done in response to the Whiskey Rebellion by George Washington. You know, the most important general in the American Revolution.
The South had seceded, and at least until that point had done so without firing a shot. The Union maintained military bases in the South in explicit defiance of this fact. I would remind you all that we warred with England twice over this very same behavior.
The second of which was so controversial it nearly caused a secession, according to you. Anyway, we get some talk about Fort Sumter, as well as some discussion of the tactics of General Sherman, and I actually do agree with Razorfist. Those tactics were needlessly brutal, and I'd argue unacceptable, even if I find some of his evidence to be on the silly side.
The TV Western Hell on Wheels features a traumatized Southern protagonist who hails from Meridian, Mississippi, a city that ceased to exist after Sherman's march to the sea. Not according to me, according to Sherman. Meridian, with its depots, storehouses, arsenal, hospitals, offices, hotels, and cantonments, no longer exists, he stated, as a city still smoldered behind him.
I just want to point out how his quote is dated 7 years before the Civil War started, because Razorfist, and I cannot stress this enough, is really, really bad at this. And yes, Razorfist does go on to play a clip from the Western Hell on Wheels, where a character discusses how they are traumatized from what they saw as a result of the actions of General Sherman. Of course, given this example is entirely fictional, it doesn't prove anything, especially because pieces of even historical fiction aren't required to be accurate to real events. You do understand that, right? Columbus didn't discover America along with the help of a talking woodworm like this is the Magic Voyage, and the Titanic wasn't saved by a puppy-faced octopus like in The Legend of the Titanic, to give 2 examples. Anyway, final thoughts. The history Razorfist presents is incredibly distorted, and there's nothing else that can really be said on that matter. Good night, and good luck.